We've heard the critical concerns raised around low intra-trade in Africa, accounting for only 16%. What are some of those barriers to intra-African trade, and how can we better change the status quo?
And you're right, there are still a number of barriers that are inhibiting intra-regional trade within Africa, but obviously there are initiatives behind the scenes that are trying to unlock that. But just to give a few examples, we can't move goods seamlessly across borders within the African continent because we have too many border posts and too many border controls. So that's an impediment to doing trade because it takes too long to move goods across the continent. But even with people, Africans still need visas to go to many African countries. That is a barrier to trade. So if you can't move people, how can you move goods? One follows the other. And then of course we need to harmonize things like tariffs so that we can start to implement the AFCFTA. Africa, if taken as a whole, is a marketplace of 1.4 billion people. So can you imagine the opportunities that opens up? And then of course you have the logistical barriers where we need road, rail, infrastructure, we need seaports that function and can take large vessels. So all of these problems we have to tackle, in succession in order to try and ramp up that intra-regional trade figure.
But we've had the African Continental Free Trade for a few years now, yet we haven't seen much improvement in terms of growing our trade within the continent. How can we better enhance this particular initiative?
Yeah. I think the implementation is actually on course. Unfortunately, if you're sitting outside of all the work that is being done, it seems like it's slow, but you will start to see momentum. If you look at the regional economic blocks, you already have regional economic hubs where intra-regional trade within those hubs is working very well. SADC, the East African community, we now just need to collapse it into the rest of the continent. And there are a lot of initiatives actually, for example, that Afreximbank is doing to try and facilitate that trade. For example, we've established the Africa Trade Exchange, which is a digital exchange where buyers and sellers can list their goods and pay for their goods and receive funds in local currency. And underpinning the Africa Trade Exchange, you have banks that will finance the trade that is traded on that platform, and Afreximbank also uses its Pan-African payments and settlement system to also support trade. So all of these initiatives, as they start to ramp up, we should start seeing the figure of inter-regional trade ramping up. And maybe I would just say that even though the Africa figure is still lagging at between 15-16%, within Afreximbank as an institution, the share of our intra-African trade that we're financing has been going up. It's in excess of 20% and will continue to ramp up.
Gwenny also highlighted the issue of tariffs. What measures can be taken that is to address non-tariff barriers that hinder trade in Africa?
So one of the things that Afreximbank has looked at to try and encourage countries to implement AFCFTA is to set up a tariff adjustment fund so that those countries that see an immediate impact, negative impact from tariffs, can be made whole until the volumes of trade into their markets increase and can compensate for any loss in tariffs. So that tariff adjustment fund will compensate those countries who feel like by dropping tariffs they are losing revenue, they'll be made whole through that fund.
One of the aspects that the speakers also highlighted was the role of small and medium enterprises in terms of trade. How can African countries improve access to trade financing, of course incorporating SMEs?
Yeah, SMEs are so important. They are the engines of any economy, and unfortunately SMEs still suffer the highest rejection rate when it comes to accessing finance. So I think banks need to partner with institutions such as Afreximbank, for example, development finance institutions, so that we can implement alternative means of financing SMEs. And there are a number of tools that Afreximbank is implementing in that regard. We have a supply chain finance program, or payables finance that we're rolling out across the continent. This is very well suited to SMEs. We have a factoring program, and in fact during this seminar we have a whole one-day factoring workshop so that African bankers and non-bank financial institutions can have an appreciation of how factoring can actually start to offer access to finance for SMEs.
The aspect of African economies moving away from exporting raw materials and having to add value additions and to grow economies as well. How can we better do that?
So from an African Bank perspective, one of the things we're doing is financing and developing industrial parks across the African continent. And these industrial parks will be focused on things like light manufacturing, garments. We already have a very successful one in Benin. There's a big garment factory. We've launched them in 5 other African countries and continuing to build the hard infrastructure and then attracting the companies that will operate in these industrial parks. The whole idea is exactly what you said, so that we start to add value to our commodities and products before we export them outside the African continent.